Let's see. It looks like we are live. I believe. Yeah, we are live. We've been live for about 15 seconds now. So, all good for me. Everyone, welcome back. Vassal Grace here, joined by the famous Jennings, talking about the conclusion of the equally famous, potentially infamous, 100 Years' War. So, Josh, why don't you give a quick recap while I go ahead and tweet out the information for our followers.
Recap of what we've gone over so far?
Yeah.
Okay, we talked about the lead up to the conflict and our progress thus far. I think we left off at Agincourt, I believe. Or was it just before that?
We have not quite gotten to Agincourt yet.
Okay. The dynastic struggles between England and France. We started from the Angevin Empire, and the repercussions of essentially the situation where the King of England was also a vassal to the King of France, and just the outcome of that. Now we're coming up to really like the climax of the situation.
Yes, and this phase here, the final phase of the war, as I said, is the Lancastrian phase, and it's a relatively short part of the war. I think it's about 38 years, from 38 years, from 1415 to 1453. Although I suppose in the 100 Years' War, 38 years is quite a long time. It'd be about a third of the war. Well, I guess that fits rather nicely. I don't even know what I'm talking about. All right, so I'll give, as always, I'll read from my pre-prepared script, and then we'll stop and talk a little bit as things come up. All right. If you remember, Richard III was King of England. Richard III had other matters to attend to than to assault French land and reclaim the English Empire. He had to stop a brief uprising of the lords in England and fight campaigns in Ireland. Interestingly, one participant in this rebellion was his cousin, Henry, the son of John of Gaunt, who you referenced in the last stream. Henry eventually decided to join the Teutonic Knights in crusade against the pagan Lithuanians, and met moderate success. He also vowed to free Jerusalem, but never got the chance. Henry was denied the automatic inheritance of John of Gaunt's land and title upon his death, and so returned to England, while Richard was on expedition in Ireland. He quickly gained enough power to be proclaimed king, having seized lands from his rivals. Richard II was imprisoned and later died, and his son was ignored as heir. Henry IV was now King of England, starting the Lancaster dynasty. Henry received assistance from the church, and so backed them whenever he could. This included the proclamation against the Lollards and the decree to burn them at the stake. Despite his relatively close relationship with Parliament, he steadfastly refused to consider their idea to take church lands, and they begged the king to forget the request. Any comments there, or should I continue?
Well, I mean, it's that's going to play out pretty importantly because the Lollards are effectively a proto-Protestant group, and the Reformation is going to draw on those influences as it proceeds. So we're starting to see the beginnings of the reaction that is going to be the Reformation starting out here in England during the 100 Years' War. And of course, in England, England will go fully for the Reformation in the end, even though it takes quite a while.
Right. So as with other instances, I think, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, like Wycliffe, these are kind of, and Jan Hus, these were pseudo-Protestants that essentially were prior to...
I would say they're pseudo-Protestants. I'd call them more proto-Protestants. I mean, certainly they do share more with Protestants than Catholics. For instance, Wycliffe denies transubstantiation. they are definitely the forerunners to a more, I would say, I guess, Calvinism more so than Lutheranism. And they both take place before we finish the Hundred Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
Radcliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia, um, and of course, the situation in Bohemia, although it's not directly tied with the Hundred Years' War, is contemporaneous with that war, and Hus's influence in Bohemia will be very strong up until the Battle of White Mountain. Bohemia is a strong Protestant area, and White Mountain will end that, but that's quite a ways off. We're talking 30 Years' War at that point.
Mm-hmm. But what's interesting to note, and I actually put this on my timeline recently, with one of my mutuals, was the interesting thing about the Hussites was the heresy that they committed was one called Utraquism, which was the belief that it is necessary to receive both species of the Eucharist. Which is interesting to me because, obviously as Catholics, the reason that's a heresy is because we teach that either what was once bread and what was once wine both individually contain the full body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Correct. Right?
Correct.
What they say is the wine is the blood and the bread is the body. Obviously, you need them both. But the difference is, obviously, in Orthodox Catholicism, both species contain both bread and body. And the Eucharist, while a excellent sacramental, is not necessary for salvation. The interesting thing that I talked about with this mutual is what is such a violent heresy worth fighting wars and battles over is something that not even, 30% of Catholics can agree on? What is it, some 70% of Catholics don't recognize the true presence of the Eucharist?
Right. Yeah, and one of the reasons why it's important with Jan Hus and questions of that is that the Jan Hus situation is one that's going to play heavily into how things play out in the Reformation. When the Emperor is going to have Luther come before him, one of the stipulations was that Luther had to have safe conduct, and even though Jan Hus, I believe, was granted safe conduct, in the end he was burnt or executed. I can't remember if it was exactly he was burnt or not, but regardless, he was not given safe conduct away from the council. So that was one of the big concerns with the Reformation. And of course, at the Council of Trent, the idea of requiring communion under both kinds is anathematized.
Mm-hmm.
So these situations are directly which are directly in play in the 15th century and the 14th century, are going to see their outcomes in the latter 16th century, early 17th century.
Right, so this is the first direct thing we can point to, which we made reference to in the last stream, that will play out in the future, which have immense ramifications for the present day. But I'll continue. Despite other remarkable notes of Henry IV's reign, such as the only visit from a Byzantine emperor to England, he died as a result of a plethora of ailments. He died not in Jerusalem on crusade, as allegedly foretold and intended, but in the Jerusalem chamber of an abbey. Henry V succeeded his father and was soon to revive the claim of England to the French throne. Demanding money from the outstanding ransom of the late John II, he demanded the recognition of Normandy as an English possession. He promised to renounce the claims to the French throne, provided he marry Charles VI's daughter and receive a dowry of 2 million crowns. The demand of 3.6 million total crowns was outrageous, and the French politely countered, simply offering a dowry of 600,000 crowns, but nothing else besides the marriage. So basically the French say, you're going to get married with 600,000 crowns as opposed to 3.6 million, but the French also refused to recognize Normandy, so that's what it is in sum. Henry felt insulted and mocked. He landed in Normandy in 1415, and besieged the city of Harfleur, which, as you all know, this is told in Shakespeare's play Henry V, which is one of my favorites. The lengthy siege saw the English triumphant, which I could go into the monologue of Once More Into the Breach that I had memorized at one point. No matter. That's a little humble brag right there. Not so humble brag.
If you forgot it, I mean, what's the bragging part all about?
So a lengthy siege saw the English triumphant, but they were exhausted and ravaged by disease. Henry V decided to withdraw from the campaign to reorganize, but was hounded by the French. Henry was distracted by this, having vowed to avenge the town of Soissons, an English-held town that had been massacred and raped by the, quote, liberating, end quote, French. Soissons had been dedicated to the saints Crispin and Crispinian. His distress aside, the French caught up with King Harry and his force. The day was 25 October, 1415. It was the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. There's a little bit of divine intervention and divine justice on the French is about to rain down on here. I even make reference in my notes here. Any fan of Shakespeare might recall from the play Henry V the famous speeches of the titular character at Harfleur and the battle site on St. Crispin's Day. Though dramatized, there is accounts of Henry V addressing the English before the battle. Henry V gave orders to the English to spend the night in silence, threatening to take an ear of any man if there was a sound. The English confessed before the battle, and Henry noted that he would rather die than be captured and ransomed, a privilege afforded to him by his status. Some accounts suggest Henry told his archers, which accounted for 7,000 of his 9,000 men, that their capture would result in their index finger and middle fingers being cut off, so they could never shoot again. Though this may have occurred, it is unlikely that the French would have stopped there, as there would be no point in leaving a common soldier alive, there would be no ransom to gain, and the archer would most likely have been executed. So, I don't know whether you're not familiar with this or not, Joshua. I'm sure you are. You're a very learned man, well-traveled man. You're familiar with the English insult. It's like the peace sign, but turned backwards, right?
I can't say I am.
Well, for my listeners, the peace sign that Americans give has the palm and curled fingers facing the recipient. The English insult has the back of the hand. It's the same sign, but the back of the hand faces the recipient. It is a insult that roughly translates to up yours, and the myth is that it resulted from English archers using that to mock French knights, as it was the fingers they used to pull the bowstrings on their longbows, and that it was so significant because captured English bowmen would have their index finger and middle finger chopped off. Now, the reason, like I just said, that that's somewhat implausible is that the French would have no reason to keep them alive. So, while it's possible that that was a part of the torture and execution process, it's unlikely that there were many Englishmen walking around without their index and middle fingers, as the French probably would have just killed them. So, just a little anecdote. Alright, let's get to the battle itself. The English forces drew up between two woods, chiefly that of Agincourt. The English held a defensible position that was reinforced by their work, i.e. they used sharpened stakes. The French had a vastly superior force, numerically speaking. The estimates reach as many as 50,000 men, and the armor of the French being so significant that the French no longer even considered the longbowmen to be much of a threat. The pride of the French was their ultimate undoing. They neglected to deploy their own archers or crossbowmen to engage the English whatsoever, and the nobles and men-at-arms insisted in being in the vanguard in order to win captives and ransom. Despite this, the French waited. It should be noted that there were heavy rains the night before the battle. That's why they waited, so the ground could dry for their horses. Reinforcements were on their way, and they hoped to encircle and trap the English. Henry, thinking this was the case, advanced his line to provoke combat. The archers moved their stakes, planting them forward, redeployed, and then fired a volley at the French to start the battle. The French could have shattered the English line as they moved forward, in theory, but the French were in no rush to give battle. Some even suggested that they believed the English were attacking their lines, and others state the French cavalry were tending to their horses and so were not ready to charge. When the charge did come, it was delayed and not at full strength, and was hampered by the muddy ground. The longbowmen played their role in this point of the battle. At this point of technological development, as I said before, it is widely agreed that a well-made suit of armor was essentially invulnerable to arrows, except perhaps at extremely close range and in non-fatal areas. The French knights occasioned not even to carry shields, so complete was their protection with their armor. The longbow could perhaps penetrate with a lucky shot or a cheap or poorly made suit of armor, but it was no longer the devastating weapon that it had been at Crécy. Instead, the archers killed or mutilated the French horses, which prevented the shock charge from reaching the English line, and killing French in horse falls or trampling from the retreating and panicked horses. The French would have to advance on foot. However, the mud hampered them once again, and the French advance floundered in the mud. The arrows that rained down were more psychological than deadly, but the archers were not without benefit. Despite being far more nimble than modern concepts suggest, the added weight of the armor, around 60 pounds, caused the French to sink into the mud during their advance. What I mean by that, a quick aside, and I know this is less your area of expertise, and so I'm trying to get through it quickly so we can talk about the ramifications. I'm a military historian, so this part fascinates me. 60 pounds is roughly the amount that it weighed on a knight for his whole armor, which, if you look at a modern soldier, they wear about 80 pounds. And the difference being that a modern soldier wears that 80 pounds almost entirely on his torso and back, whereas the knight wore it over his entire body. So a medieval knight was actually, contrary to popular belief, far more maneuverable and agile than a modern soldier. They were also essentially as fit as modern rugby players, so another thing to take into account. Many became stuck in the slow advance, some even drowned in the mud during the battle, and all became fatigued. The majority of French dead did not come from arrows, but from the English footmen and archers using melee weapons. The trapped and exhausted French heavy infantry were hacked to death by the English, who were much more lightly armored. The French were soon pressed on all sides by the archers, who had fired at point-blank range, exhausted their arrows, and charged. The French behind surged in, and in the close pressing hindered their comrades from using their weapons, and by some accounts caused some in the middle to suffocate in their armor. A local French knight of Agincourt led a small number of soldiers and commoners in an attack on the English baggage train, capturing wealth, treasure, and one of Henry's crowns. Thinking himself outflanked, Henry ordered the execution of all but a few French prisoners. His knights protested, whether out of chivalry or a desire for the wealth of ransom, or both. At any rate, it was a bloody affair, Henry V threatening to hang any man who disobeyed him. The losses were catastrophic for the French, and hundreds of nobles were captured or killed, with thousands of troops slain. The English losses, though not insignificant given the size of their army, were far less than the French. French contingent that was not present at the battle was the Burgundians, as the Duke of Burgundy was a rival to the French throne and had been allied with the English before. While negotiating with the Dauphin and the French, the Duke of Burgundy was assassinated, and his son Philip, allied with Henry V of England, moved to seize Paris.
Right, the assassination of John.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I don't in this. So if you would please elaborate, because you know more about this than I do.
There's nothing too much to elaborate. Charles, who was the Dauphin, and John, I think the second of Burgundy, had a meeting. Mind you, I think they're cousins. On this bridge, and during the meeting, something went wrong. No one's really sure on what happened. The details. We have some information from different sources, but it's like, it's conflicting information. But regardless of what happened, what ended happening was John the Fearless was assassinated, and his son, Philip, called the Good, immediately took the English side of what was going on. It was a big tactical blunder, really. Um, and so Burgundy took the side of the English for quite a long time. Um, what's interesting to note, though, is that because loyalties are what loyalties are, many of the people who were in the family of the Duke of Burgundy died in the Battle of Agincourt on the French side.
Mm-hmm.
Because although they had family, they were also vassals. I think it might have been like two different brothers of either John or Philip died at Agincourt. Um, I don't remember exactly who it was. Um, but it just goes to show you that family and personal loyalties and things like that um, were very complex, right? So um, that's
Right.
important to keep in mind with these things. The chess pieces, so to speak, are oh, there it is. It was Philip's brother. So the sons of the assassinated Duke of Burgundy, two of them died in Agincourt.
Right.
And of course, Philip the Bold, who is the duke who takes over for John. I'm sorry, Philip the Good, who takes over for John.
Who takes Paris? Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I completely goofed myself up on this one. The two brothers were the uncles of the assassinated duke, not the sons.
Right.
Right. The duke that takes over after John the Fearless dies at the bridge in I forget what city the bridge was in. Philip the Good. He is the one who's going to capture Joan of Arc in the end.
Right.
He also founds the Order of the Golden Fleece. He is pretty much one of the most outstanding figures of his day. His court is the court that decides good taste in Europe. The court of Burgundy is the place to be. It is 19th century Paris in 15th century world.
Some of my ancestors came from Burgundy. Just throwing that out there.
Well, I mean, you know, great mustard, great wine. What is there to dislike?
Oui, monsieur, oui. Oh.
But Philip, John's son, is very capable, and we'll see that in how he navigates between the English and the French to his benefit. Burgundy only becomes stronger through the 100 Years' War.
Correct.
Although it's all going to come crashing down because of his son, but that's later.
Yes. Where was I? Okay. So Philip takes Paris after allying with Henry V. They then force Charles VI, King of France, which he was the guy that was so crazy that he after he thought he was made of glass, and he attacked and killed some of his own men. He signed the Treaty of Troyes, which married Henry to Charles VI's daughter and made their heirs the heirs of both France and England. And this is the conclusion of Henry V. The Shakespeare play, that is. The soon-to-be Charles VII, the Dauphin, was declared illegitimate, and Henry V declared the legitimate heir to the French throne, the legitimate son of Charles VI, and his children the legitimate heirs by the French Estates General. To further add to England's triumph, a Franco-Scottish force was scattered with a loss of 3,000 men, and the Scottish treasury was also captured at Fresnay. This all occurred between 1419 and 1420. In 1421, battle was again joined with the English in the Franco-Scottish alliance. The Duke of Clarence, Henry V's brother, was killed in the Battle of Baig, where he rashly charged the enemy, resulting in his own death, though it is disputed who killed him precisely. But it is not disputed that one man named John Carmichael unhorsed him. I'm not sure the significance of that, but I wrote it down. On the death or capture of all 1,500 men he deployed. The King of England, and nominally of France, soon died in 1422, and the King of France then joined his son-in-law in earthly slumber. On his deathbed, Henry V stressed that the Burgundian alliance must last, key prisoners must be kept, and there should be no treaty until Normandy was English and Troyes was recognized. The French people and nobility refused to acknowledge the infant son of Henry V, known as Henry VI, and Henry VI of England and Henry II of France, and they instead rallied behind Charles VII. War continued. English forces under the Earl of Salisbury won a victory over the Franco-Scottish alliance in 1423, only to have the alliance defeat the English in battle soon after. I don't understand. Defeated by the English in battle soon after. It was Bedford who shattered the alliance, killing the Scots on the field almost to a man, their commanders included, and the French taking similarly heavy losses, even though the English suffered themselves. The English were at the height of their power at this time under Henry VI, from Brittany to Burgundy, and the Channel to Loire, with notable exceptions. Hope was not lost, however, for the eldest daughter of the church. The English were pressing their advantage and moved to besiege Orleans. Their situation was desperate, and the Dauphin Charles VII was at a loss of what to do. Luckily for Charles, several events were about to develop by the grace of God to benefit France. First, the Earl of Salisbury, the English commander, was killed by the cannons of Orleans' defenders. Second, and most importantly, as you can tell from our thumbnail, an answer to the vague mutterings and prophecies around France had arrived. Joan of Arc had convinced a local lord to give her an armed escort to the Dauphin, informing him of the disaster of the Battle of Herrings well in advance of the news. Joan arrived before the royal court in 1429 and made a dramatic impression on the Dauphin and his court. Impressed, he was hesitant to trust the visions of the girl, who claimed that St. Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret had all appeared to her and told her to save France. Unverified, it would be easy to counter-claim that Charles VII was winning back his kingdom with the help of a heretic or a sorceress, but Joan's fervor and orthodoxy and piety were all confirmed by royal and church investigations. Nonetheless, Charles would decide a test would be needed, and he had little to lose trying her claims at Orleans. As was stated, quote, "To doubt or abandon without suspicion of evil would be to repudiate the Holy Spirit and to become unworthy of God's aid," end quote. Joan was given equipment from the crown and headed the relief column. She was intent on immediately taking the fight to the English, but through maneuvering, trickery, and convincing, the French convinced her to resupply the city first, where she miraculously aided the French ships in carrying supplies undetected to the city of Orleans. She entered the city to much rejoicing. Her threats and deadlines to the English were met with jeers and accusations of witchcraft. They soon knew that Joan was not idle in her assertions, nor was she a witch. Joan inspired the systemic capture of English strongholds on the southern side of Orleans. During these assaults, her piety and mercy inspired the French and humbled the English, and victory was hers, securing Orleans for France. The English, though beaten and bloodied, still held the surrounding area, and thus determined that with reinforcement and resupply, they could besiege Orleans again soon. Any thoughts on that?
The siege of Orleans is pretty darn important. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but there's a very famous book, The 15 Decisive Battles of the World. It gets mentioned a lot in the 19th century especially, and Orleans is one of those battles. Interesting to note that after Orleans, many of the battles that are included are Franco-focused. The Siege of Orleans, the Joan of Arc appearing on the scene is really what's going to save France, and because France is saved, France is going to become the strongest power in Europe without question until Germany unites in the 19th century. At least in terms of one centralized country. Spain might become more powerful in some ways.
Yeah, it's important to note.
It's a spread out empire. It's not compact as France is. But even then, Spain's power is not what it appears to be.
Well, if you think about...
Spain's rise is only possible because France is engaged in civil war.
Yes. When you think about some of these wars, like the war of, Austrian succession, talk about, we talk about World War I and World War II, and I think it was it Norm Macdonald who made the joke that World War One, Germany took on the entire world and almost won. And in the Second World War, they took on the entire world again, and it was even closer. And, it's played for laughs, but it should be noted that in some of these wars, France essentially takes on just about every major European power and either wins, negotiates a favorable settlement, or is only barely defeated. Like, it should be noted
Yeah.
that France's military prowess after the Hundred Years' War is, like you said, almost undisputed even until the Franco-Prussian War, which...
Pretty much. So I would say from about when Henry IV decides to become Catholic, up until 1850 at the Battle of Waterloo, France is capable of conducting itself independently against the rest of Europe with moderate success.
Moderate or great success, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal, and it usually wasn't always France versus the world. But there are a lot of situations that come up where it is just France versus everybody. And France can do it because, again, it's compact, it's got an incredible agricultural strength that's unrivaled. Um, and then also generally has pretty decent leadership in those years.
Mm-hmm.
France does bankrupt itself because of the new world that's coming up with banking and England's economy with ships. But you have to consider too that France was later on, and not during this period, but later on, France was not only trying to be what it already was a dominant military power in terms of just an army, it was also trying, although unsuccessfully, to match England in terms of naval strength, and it came close um, to achieving its goals many times. I mean, it took 7 coalitions to defeat the French Republic and the Napoleonic Empire that came after it. That was England trying to put together a coalition between Russia, Prussia, Austria multiple times over. It took a long time to defeat that, and even then, it wasn't necessarily final. So the United France that we're going to see coming out of the 15th century, with a complete removal of England from the continent, will isolate England. England will never become a continental power in the same way. Not even in its the days of the British Empire can England field an army to match any of the continental powers, France or what would become Germany or Austria or Prussia. And in fact, during the coalition wars, for instance, it never was able to field that kind of army either. It had to rely on the coalitions. It had its own naval presence that it had to upkeep. In fact, there was one point, I think Byron mentions it as a joke on his aside, but there was one year where the army funding was higher than the naval funding, and it created a big furor over it because England is so dependent on naval power. But the siege of Orleans is the beginning of the end for England as a continental power. After Orleans, after they're removed from the continent, finally, when Calais is lost, I think during the reign of Queen Mary.
Well, I was going to say Henry VIII's ill-advised expedition into France was also a big nail in the coffin of England's expeditions into...
Yeah, I think that nail was already put in, but I think Henry knew he didn't have any real... I mean, he might have blustered about, but just England was not going to go up against France, especially one that was pretty well proven until Francis lost to Charles at Pavia. I mean, Francis was the big honcho in Europe. Everyone kind of looked up to him because he had proven himself, Marignano. But yeah, at the time of Henry VIII, England is, I mean, everyone's always kind of just joking about England's kind of outside of Europe. It's no longer continentally important. And the center stage that's going to come out of the 100 Years' War, we're all going to start looking at Italy after the 100 Years' War ends. And that is very far removed from England. I mean, that's why the Pope felt he was strong enough to tell Henry VIII he couldn't have a divorce. Because he's just the king of this backwater little country as far as the Europeans were concerned. In the end, that might not have been the case, but, I mean, England couldn't do anything that was going on with Mediterranean affairs. what influence did they have on the Italian peninsula? They didn't have any because they had no European presence because they got kicked out of France. Mostly because of Civil War, but also because Joan of Arc appeared. And frankly, it's pretty miraculous. I mean, it's difficult to grasp Joan of Arc. And I think even people who are generally heathens, people who are hostile to religion, are very much in awe of this woman. She is just one of those people that appears in the pages of history, and everyone's like, wow, what is going on? What is the deal with this? No one really fathoms it truly. And even people who don't believe her claims find it astonishing. Just one of those moments where
you think about Mark
else
Twain.
But God could be used to describe the situation.
Think about Mark Twain, I would say almost virulently anti-Catholic person who wrote what is widely considered one of the better one of the better biographies and examinations and fair, even-handed examinations of Joan of Arc's life, was from a man who was not Catholic. That's how significant. I don't think people, like you said, I don't think people appreciate how much of an impact she really has. And that's just one example. And we could sit here and probably prattle on about a whole multitude of examples, but
it's one of more than historical consequence too, right? It's one that is an imaginative consequence. Think of all the people who wrote about Joan of Arc and how different they are. Mark Twain, Voltaire. I mean, I think Friedrich Schiller wrote a drama or something involving Joan of Arc. Those are very different people from very different time periods, with very different attitudes about religion than a typical Catholic. I mean, Voltaire was hostile to the Catholic Church. He said, "Crush the infamous thing," and she was referring to the Catholic Church. But even he couldn't help but write about this woman. You know, and of course, even in the United States, Joan of Arc has been very well regarded. I mean, there are U.S. postage stamps with Joan of Arc on it. Yeah, she's just a really incredible figure that everyone is completely in awe of, and even if they can't put words to how they feel about it, it's really incredible. It's one of those situations where how do you fathom it? And most people, of course, just go, clearly God intervened on the side of France.
All right. Well, with that, I'll continue reading. The English ability to besiege Orleans was not lost on the French, but Joan apparently did not realize the gravity of the situation. She was eventually convinced to campaign in the surrounding areas instead of driving to... I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this. Maybe you can. Rheims? Reims?
Reims? I'm not an expert. I don't know.
Instead of driving towards Reims, volunteers swarmed to serve with Joan, and a series of battles and sieges left Loire in the hands of the French. An English force under John Fastolfe and John Talbot were sent to relieve the English in the Loire region, but failed, and were intercepted at Patay. The French were led by La Hire, a ferocious and skilled warrior in the company of Joan of Arc. Attempting to operate as they had at Crécy and Agincourt, the English were caught before they could deploy their troops and were routed. It was a major victory for the French, and it shattered the myth that the English were invincible in pitched battle. This also essentially crushed England's expeditionary army and their ability to meet the French in the field of battle, and were therefore too spread thin with their garrisons and had too few experienced commanders to resist the French, who marched towards Reims, and Charles VII was officially crowned king there in 1429. Joan had seen Orleans liberated and the king crowned, and France was nearly saved. However, in an attempt to liberate more territories, Joan was captured by the English and the Burgundians. The English brought many charges against Joan, though many did not have any evidence, and those that did were falsified, or should have been granted exception by church teaching. For example, the English said that she was cross-dressing, and this was proof of her heresy and witchcraft. But in this Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas, he notes that this teaching should be overlooked in special circumstances, such as in order to avoid molestation and rape, or protection in battle, both of these circumstances having been applied to Joan of Arc. Furthermore, the English, not church guards, and prisons were used, and the bishop that tried Joan was a loyal stooge of England and had no authority over Joan in any manner. An appeal to the Pope and proper church authorities was denied, and Joan of Arc was burned at the stake as a witch and a heretic. A church investigation and inquiry would overrule this decision, and Joan would be declared a martyr and canonized as Saint Joan of Arc, patron of France. I'm sure you have plenty of comments on that one, so I'll let you run away with it for a little bit.
Just to add that this is just more part of the part of what's fascinating about Joan isn't just her success and the inspiration that she gave to men, but it was also this trial. And they said to her, I think they asked her about whether she was in a state of grace, and she answered perfectly.
This is a great one.
Complex theological question that they knew that they were going to trip her up, and they didn't, because she answered, if I am in the state of grace, may God so keep. If I am outside the state of grace, may God put me there, or something along those lines.
Yes.
And it just goes to show, it just goes to add on to the enigma that is Joan, because the typical French peasant should not have been able to answer it. It was just not something that the average French peasant was really. They're not educated. They weren't taught theology. They didn't understand these things typically.
The thing that it reminds me of is St. Thomas More's defense of himself against the English treason trials under Henry VIII. The difference here being, though, that Thomas More is a lawyer and a nobleman and a court official who's well-versed in, speechcraft.
Right.
He knows what traps they're trying to lay. He knows how to avoid their arguments, and he's well learned and studied. The fact that Joan of Arc can deliver eloquent responses to traps as readily and as eloquently as someone that versed in it, I agree. Just shows the divine quality that is working within her.
Yeah, it's more of a dramatization, but The Passion of Joan of Arc is an excellent film. It's a silent film, but it is basically her trial and execution, and it is the most it's one of the most astounding things I've ever seen. If you get a chance to watch it, you should.
All right, with that, we will continue. There's more to be had here. France had lost a hero, but not yet the war. Far from it. In 1435, Bedford of England died, and his heir, Gloucester, was not liked by the Burgundians. The Burgundians abandoned the English and returned Paris to France. This was a disastrous blow to the English situation, made all the worse that La Hire continued to defeat the English in the field of battle, and territory was being chiseled away from the English as more and more towns and castles returned to the rule of the French crown. One such territory was Normandy itself in 1450. After launching a counterattack on the French forces attacking them at Formigny, the English soon found themselves away from their defenses and vulnerable, pursuing the French and capturing their guns. However, Arthur III of Brittany arrived, and his cavalry outflanked the English, and Clermont, the French commander, rallied his troops and obliterated the English army, capturing their commander. Normandy was French once more. Calais, the Channel Islands, and Bordeaux were the only English possessions left disputed by France. Bordeaux considered themselves English after about 300 years of English rule, but the French captured it in 1451. The English, with John Talbot to lead, retook the area with popular support. However, soon after, in 1453, the French moved to take it back once more and met Talbot in battle. Jean Bureau, the French ordnance officer, fortified the French camp, and Talbot, unaware of the French strength of position, moved to attack. What happened next at Castellon was described as Crécy in reverse. The English kept pouring men and reinforcements into the battle, but they were scythed down by French artillery and cavalry. Talbot and his son were both killed. This broke the English power in Bordeaux, and it was returned to France. In hindsight, this marked the end of the 100 Years' War, in principle. That was not apparent to the sides as it is now, for minor skirmishing continued for some time. Calais was English for over 100 more years, though France took control of it in 1558. England retains control of the Channel Islands to this day, though the exchange of territory greatly favored France. In fact, if memory serves, the only time the Channel Islands have ever been disputed was when they were captured by Germany in World War II.
I don't recall there being any. There was some activity, I think, during the French Revolution, but I don't think that was never seriously undertaken.
Right. Chivalry diminished as the new advents of gunpowder weapons and the triumph of infantry over the course of the war had marginalized noble knights' efficiency and effectiveness in combat. Professional armies created to combat the rogue Free Company mercenaries by employing them began to grow. With the death of so much nobility added to the concept of national defense, nationalism grew at the expense of feudalism. The devotion and power of the crown grew, and in France, an absolute monarchy would soon emerge. In England, the crown would be in turmoil. Exhausted and embarrassed by their overall loss in the war, they would never again pursue claims to the French crown, or indeed make a landing on the continent when not supported by a large coalition. Something you had already mentioned. Henry VI lost his mind, and the War of the Roses erupted in England 2 years after the end of the 100 Years' War, determining England's rulers for years to come. Despite the disastrous start and humiliating defeats throughout the war, France had triumphed as the eldest daughter of the Church, and England would fall to heresy under Henry VIII and condemnation by the Holy Father of the Church. That's all I have written down. Now we can go to thoughts, because I have, in that final paragraph, essentially alluded to many of the things we had talked about, so we can at least sink our teeth into some of these juicier topics, such as absolutism, absolute monarchy, professional armies, the differences in military, political, and religious, and even cultural effects that this war had on Europe, specifically France and England, but most of Europe.
Yeah, well, we're just starting out. We can talk about the immediate aftermath. The immediate aftermath for England is that they're going to be engaged in the Wars of the Roses. So civil strife. So England is not only removed from the continent, but it's so engulfed in its own turmoil that it can't possibly influence affairs very strongly. I mentioned before that Edward IV at one time landed troops in Normandy, but only just so he could get paid off. He didn't plan on doing any actual fighting. That was from Louis XI, I believe, France.
That has shades of the concept of the Danegeld from back in the 10th century, 9th century.
Yeah, it was more of the fact that Edward IV had a treaty with whoever was in Burgundy. It might have been Charles at the time. I can't remember when Philip died exactly. I'm pretty sure it was Charles. He had a treaty with the guy, but he didn't want to actually do anything because he still had his own affairs to take care of, and so it was really just an excuse to say that he fulfilled his treaty while getting some money in his coffers. I think he was given 10,000 florins, something like that, and he was sent away very easily. And of course, Louis XI loved to solve problems with money. But the immediate aftermath is that England is stuck in the Wars of the Roses up until Henry VII. And the immediate aftermath for France is the Burgundian Wars. Louis XI, who is the son of the very rebellious son of Charles VII. Charles VII spends the last years of his reign reigning in his son, who not only is a troublemaker, but literally joins rebellions against the crown. In fact, he was kind of sent off to a section of France which is called the Dauphiné, because that was ruled by the Dauphin, which was Louis XI. That's where it gets the name from. Um, so, anyways, the Burgundian Wars are really what everyone points to when they talk about the end of chivalry. Charles, the Duke of Burgundy, um, is considered this romantic figure by many, and I think Sir Walter Scott specifically tunes into this. Um, and he's considered kind of like the last knight almost, and he's fighting for the romantic, feudalistic Middle Ages versus the nationalizing, um, kind of absolutist figure of Louis XI, the Spider. Um, it's not quite true. It's not quite that way. In fact, they called him Charles the Bold, but Charles the Rash is probably more accurate. He was a pretty silly man, um, who completely ruined what the last 3 or 4 generations of the Dukes of Burgundy had built up. And he gets himself killed. Oddly enough, the battle where he died, the Battle of Nancy, he took a halberd to the face. But that battle is interesting because on the opposite ends of each battle, those two families would one day wed uh, in the Austrian Empire. It would be Maria Theresa and her husband, who's the Duke of Lorraine. Duke of Lorraine was the one who was fighting against Charles at Nancy. So that's an interesting fact that those two lines, which were enemies in the 15th century, would later on um, lead to effectively the current ruling, well, not ruling now, but the family of the Holy Roman Empire that would become the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But that conflict takes up France's occupation, occupies France until Charles VIII descends upon Italy shortly afterward, and that sets the stage for the big conflict between the Valois and Habsburg. And part of that comes from the fall of the Burgundian Wars as well, because Mary, who is the daughter of Charles of Burgundy, decides to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, who's Maximilian. Maximilian's son is Philip, who would be married to Juana la Loca, one of the Mad, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So through her, she was the mother of Charles V, and through her, we're going to see a Spanish, German, Habsburg Empire. So France is going to find itself, because Louis overplayed his hand with Burgundy, played it perfectly up until the last second. Right then, it was at total victory. He just makes this rash move to just immediately occupy Burgundy, and it scares Mary away. So that leads us to basically the next 100 years. The next 100 years is the conflict between the Habsburgs and the Valois. It's going to be monumental for France too, because France is going to be one of the major battlegrounds of the Reformation. And in the end, the Valois die out. The Habsburgs are able to keep the French from turning Protestant, and the Bourbon king, Henry IV, decides to convert to become king.
Paris is worth a mass, as he said.
It's worth a mass, exactly. So that's what happens with France. In the Far East, in Constantinople, about 2 months before the Battle of Castellon, which we just talked about, which was the last battle of the 100 Years' War, Constantinople falls. Someone recently was talking about why didn't the West honor its agreement to come to the aid of Constantinople after the Council of Florence? And the reason why is because of the 100 Years' War, right? The French and the English were tied up in conflict with one another, and they weren't interested or able to assist with that. And the Pope did send an army, which was defeated. It was composed of mostly, I think, Poles. That army, at the Battle of Varna, was defeated. In fact, the papal legate was killed. So Constantinople's last possible assistance from any Western power, or I should say, west of Constantinople, was gone then. So because England and France were not able to assist, just the fall of Constantinople is a foregone conclusion. And because of that fall, the Greek learning goes into, and it had already been going into it for a while, but many of the refugees from Constantinople settle in Italy, and they share a lot of their Greek texts and codices. Um, so you had the Renaissance on top of that. So Italy, with the Hundred Years' War, the center stage changes from France to Italy, and that's going to determine the next 100 years. And that's basically the big fallout. We have the rise of nationalism. We have stronger states than we had before. Both England after the Wars of the Roses and France, the state is much more powerful than it was. Spain also centralizes. Of course, Italy is decentralized because it's Italy, a bunch of city states. Um, and so, basically, it's like the scramble for Africa, but it's the scramble for Italy, really. And that's where things are trending.
Well, see, I'm glad I brought you on this stream for both of them because you've offered some insight that I both didn't know or didn't think to include. And my original plan was simply just to, like, if you watched my Reconquista one, was basically just to read what I wrote and then, like, offer my own personal insights. So, with your own unique perspective and historical knowledge, you've greatly built upon the foundations that I laid with here. So, I appreciate that. It was very good, very good. But yeah, as you said, like the political and social changes. I don't think you didn't really quite get into the professional army aspect, which is a military one that I had, and basically.
Well, I think that comes a little bit later. We still see in Europe the same sorts of I guess more mercenary kind of armies.
Well,
In fact,
mercenaries.
it's after the Hundred Years' War at Marignano when Francis I of France defeats a large contingent of Swiss pikemen, and it effectively kind of like dispels the myth of the strength of the Swiss. Um, at least in Italy, the condottieri are everywhere. The mercenary armies kind of rule. Um, it's really when you get to people like Cromwell and
The
Gustavus
new model
Adolphus,
army.
Sweden, the new model army, and King of Sweden's army. It kind of sets
Yeah.
the mold that gets kind of.
Well, the Empire had state troops at that point to counter. Like Tilly had a professional army of state troops that countered Gustavus Adolphus, and I believe at White Mountain that you referenced that the Imperial commander also had professional troops.
Yeah, there definitely are professional troops, but I don't think that the Hundred Years' War is not that it's insignificant, but I don't think it's this marked turn that we see. Whereas, like Cromwell, for instance, it seems to be a big evolution forward. Of course, we're still at professionalism. We're making our way beyond that to complete civilian army, right? This would come in the French Revolution. We're going to see real volunteers out of a nationalistic fervor, as opposed to just I got called up. The peasants typically hated being called up for conflict because they had to leave their crops behind. So no one's managing their affairs while they're gone.
Unless they were lucky enough to have an elder son who was in that sweet area where he wasn't quite old enough to be called up into conflict, but was old enough to, manage the responsibilities. But that's very rare, It's not like...
Well, I remember there was this, this is much later than the Hundred Years' War, but during the French Revolution era, where the one guy didn't want to go to war, because at the time, they weren't taking married men. They would only take single men. So he went around proposing to like nine different women to so he didn't have to go, and the ninth woman accepted his proposal.
That's pretty interesting. That's
I might just start doing that myself. See where it goes.
avoid conscription. Unfortunately, America has no such law precluding married men from the
No, but that
conscription.
is the consequence of the results of the French Revolution. The civilian uh, civilian armies is that egalite means egalite. Who cares if you're married or your social class?
We
That's what we are now.
now,
Of course, you can always pay your way out of things.
yeah, and you saw that in the American Civil War.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, conscription is
It
something.
makes sense, though. I mean, you need money to wage wars, and I'm sure that under the right circumstances, a certain amount of money is worth more than one soldier in the field.
Now, it might behoove us, and I'm there might be some listeners that don't quite understand. Like, we've been talking about what happened after feudalism. We talk about the rise of absolute monarchies, the expansion of certain powers in Europe, the professional armies, conscription, stuff like that. It might be worthwhile to explain the idea of feudalism and the idea of how that relayed as far as warfare went or society went, just so they know what the change is actually coming from. I don't think we ever said what the status quo was before we went in to say how that it changed.
The status quo effectively was is that people uh, had their different spheres, their different classes, and whatever class that you were born into was pretty much what you died into. Um, the exception is probably the church. Church provides some opportunities for social climbing, but you can't really pass that on to your children because you can't be married. But of course, oddly enough, the 16th century popes, Alexander VI, the Farnese Pope, for instance, they're going to try and change that. They specifically do try to hand things on to their children. It doesn't work out so well for the Borgias. It works out far better for the Farnese. Um, but effectively, um, feudalism is a system whereby there's a warrior class, there is a working class, and there is a clerical class. And you have certain responsibilities, each class does, uh, as that different section of society. Um, After the Black Death, which I think is around 1350, 1348, that time period, which
Yeah, it
is
was it was about halfway through the first phase of the war that we talked about, or towards the
right.
end.
Um, More middle class families are sprouting up because of the diminished population. The social classes are beginning to change a bit. And of course, in places like Italy, the situation is often different because places like Florence are banking cities. The Medici family are called God's bankers. Um, so you're starting to see this middle class develop outside of um, the peasantry. And what we see during the Hundred Years' War, for instance, this is true this time period, is that's the class is starting to get stronger. Charles VII became very notorious because of how he treated a certain banker. I think his name is Jacques Coeur. Locked the dude up, and I think he died in prison. But he got all that money from him. And this is the time of the Fugger family in Germany. Um, they were immensely rich. The Holy Roman Empire borrowed mass sums from the family. And actually, one of the cool things is I think they're called the Fuggerai or Fuggeray. I don't know how to pronounce it. But they're
Fugare.
basic. Yeah, they're these really cool shelters, and it was like a single gold piece to stay there, with the provision that you prayed for the family, for their welfare once a day. So it was an opportunity to help people who were in more dire straits in life, which is a really cool idea, and I think a similar concept should be revisited by people who seek to help people like the homeless. Anyways, so this middle class has to develop, and of course, in France, it's going to come to a head in the revolution, because the bourgeoisie, at the same time as wanting to be nobility, hates the nobility.
The Jacobins.
Yeah, I would. Of course, not all the bourgeoisie are Jacobins, but you know, in fact, the Jacobins are typically lower middle class, if you
Yeah,
guess.
and as
they're
I've
effectively the sans-culottes are working class, but they're not. They're craftsmen. They're not peasants.
No.
They're not the poor.
Yes, it is important to note that most revolutions come, if not all revolutions, come from the middle, what we would consider the middle class.
Yeah, and also long before the Revolution, with the Reformation, a lot of the strength of the Reformation comes from the middle classes as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, it's more geographical than just class. For instance, if you're in Italy or Spain, like, it doesn't matter what your class is, there's no chance of you becoming a Protestant without very serious. But in places like France and Germany, and England, the middle class is a strong bastion of Protestant support.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to mention before we go down this rabbit hole too was with feudalism, the military aspect it was contractual. Locke talks about the social contract, but basically the contract of feudalism was the wealthier man had a group of retainers that could defend the area against small threats. So if I'm thinking back to, Alfred the Great of England, this is the time of feudalism's real, the time that it was tested, I guess, the most famously. So you had these people that, the serfs that said, yeah, I'll work the land, my family will be tied to the land, and we will provide you with food as long as you provide us with, spiritual, physical protection. So, you will provide us with a church, you will provide us with goods that we obviously can't produce, in your village. You will provide us with protection from raiders, and in turn we will provide you with food, and if need be, when you summon us for a larger force like the feared, we will also serve in your army. And that sort of contract emerged. To say that it emerged in what we would consider the quote-unquote Dark Ages is a little short-sighted, because its origins were they weren't exactly the same as the Alright, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here. So, the Marian reforms in the Roman Empire shifted the Imperial Legion, or the Roman Legion, I should say, from a draft, essentially, under the Republic, where it was kind of like that. It was, each Roman citizen had the obligation to serve in the military, and they had the famous triple line, the Hastati, the Principes, and then the Triarii, I think. Then after the Marian reforms, it became the professional army with the legionaries that we know today. Well, feudalism was not like that. So anywhere the Roman Empire endured, in the West until the 500s-ish? Correct me if I'm... Yeah. And in the East until 1400s. That was not... The prevailing attitude was not really that one of feudalism. What we can really view feudalism as was the non-Roman areas, principally the Germanic tribes, the idea of the comitatus, which was a Roman term given to the tribal relations, or the comes, which were the subordinates of the chieftain. And basically, if you read Beowulf, they give a hint of the Comitatus relationship, which is before the heir apparent of a certain area becomes the chieftain or the lord or noble or however you want to say it, he is supposed to provide gifts of gold and armor and weapons, to his retainers so they will be loyal to him. So basically he promises them protection and riches in return for their service. So that is referred to the Comitatus relationship, and it was so effective, and I'm sure you've heard of this. It was so effective, the oaths of loyalty that were secured from this relationship, that it made the Germans famous for their battlefield loyalty, to the point where the Romans themselves hired Germans as their personal bodyguards. And that's where the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor was made up entirely out of Scandinavian and Germans, because the Romans knew that the Germans valued their oaths and their loyalty based off of that Comitatus relationship. And so that's kind of where where feudalism comes from, this idea of I provide you with a tangible, it's very tangible. I provide you with this tangible benefit of protection, of wealth. You provide me with the tangible benefit of service and food and stuff like that. So I just wanted to clear the air. That's another little bit of history. So we can see gradually, as we said, it's not like a definitive after the 100 Years' War ends that this disappears. But you can see how the 100 Years' War kind of, at the very least, are the rocks that start the avalanche of the ending of this relationship and this way of life.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I think I've pretty much addressed most of the stuff I wanted to hit. We're about at an hour 11.
Yeah, I think we got everything.
Yeah, we've hit pretty much everything. If you want to be a co-host or a regular guest, if you will, just let me know. I was gonna have to think of a new topic to talk about. Probably something to do with Rome, maybe. Could go into the Spanish Inquisition. I might put it to a Twitter poll, unless you have input that you want to. If you want to come back, I'd love to have you.
Well, more than happy to.
Yeah.
I don't know. It'll depend topic by topic by how useful I can be, but.
Yeah. It does work better with a little bit of back and forth. I don't know if you watched the Reconquista one, but it's pretty much just me trying to entertain myself for an hour. So, yeah, a little bit of back and forth. We'll see. Hey, we could just go off the fly. I could just decide pretty much on a day and then see that day what we want to talk about. But yeah. I think for that, we'll end the stream now, and we can talk about it after. What do you think?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, with that, thank you for watching. We didn't have that many concurrent viewers, but those who watched the replay, thank you, and God bless.